Okay, so this one is a big one. The title is pretty self-explanatory, and with us now closing in on the 30th anniversary of the UFC, I've decided to take a dive into the deepest sections of the MMA vaults, and whether we are looking at overall technique, the context of the win itself, personal preference, or just the sheer violence of it all. These, in my opinion, are the greatest UFC KOs of every year since 1993. 1993, Gerard Gordeau versus Taylor Tooley. What better place to begin than with the very first knockout in the history of the UFC, a finish that came in the opening fight of UFC 1. And in many ways, it was a head kick that set the tone for what would follow. Look, mixed martial arts was pretty wacky in those days, and seeing Gerard Gordeau knocking the tooth out of the hulking Taylor Tooley, and yeah, you can actually see the tooth fly out, because, well, Tooley wasn't exactly wearing a mouthguard. But hey, it was the 1990s. But yeah, this one was quite violent, kicking things off with a pretty easy pick. 1994, Patrick Smith versus Scott Morris. Okay, trust me, these knockouts do get easier to stomach as we go on, but Patrick Smith's victory over Scott Morris was important for reasons beyond the really horrible barrage of shots that Morris absorbed before the fight was eventually stopped. This fight actually led to the formation of rules surrounding TKO victories and the entire notion of intelligent defense. Just letting a fighter go unconscious was a pretty awful starting point, but thankfully things changed shortly after. 1995, Paul Varelans versus Cal Worsham. Another area in the rule set that had not yet been refined was the usage of 12-6 elbows. Now I know that a lot of us think that the whole idea of a 12-6 elbow being banned is a bit silly, make of that what you will, but for the massive Paul Varelans, hitting the technique as he towered over Cal Worsham was a pretty superb way to get his man out of there. That elbow came down like a hammer, and full credit to the referee for getting right in there immediately after the shot landed, because that man was done. 1996, Gary Goodridge versus Paul Herrera. We've got some more elbows coming up next, this time with yet another wide physical gulf, a common occurrence in the sport in those days. Gary Goodridge and Paul Herrera look like they were separated by several weight classes, and based on the 70-pound gulf in their fighting weights, they might as well have been, and probably should have been. Goodridge basically got a hold of Herrera, found his way into a crucifix position, and after realizing that the opening was there, he went to work with an incredibly violent flurry of elbows, marking his name in the history books with one of the most brutal finishes you're ever going to see. 1997, Mark Kerr versus Greg Stott. Probably the most straightforward and easy to stomach KO so far comes in courtesy of the great Mark Kerr, who basically used his supreme physicality and power to land one massive knee that dropped his opponent Greg Stott there and then. Simple, effective, and still totally legal today. Some great work by the famed wrestler. 1998, Pete Williams versus Mark Coleman. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. And while many knockouts over the years have encapsulated this age-old saying, a personal favorite of mine was the thunderous head kick delivered by Pete Williams to the chin of Mark Coleman. And just to sprinkle in another famous saying, you can't put steroids in your chin. And forgive me, no burn intended. It was the 1990s, they were all on steroids. We love you, Mark Coleman, but I guess it just wasn't his night. 1999, Brad Kohler versus Steve Judson. Brad Kohler is not a name that is familiar to most MMA fans, but I would actually put this one-hitter quitter from 1999 up against most punches in UFC history. The darting in and out, the speed, the connection, the way Judson dropped, the walk-off that followed, pure perfection. This would actually be the only win that Kohler scored in the UFC, but hey, to look like a world beater on a massive stage for just one night is more than most fighters will ever achieve. So kudos to you, Kohler. 2000, Jens Pulver versus John Lewis. At the time, this next knockout was one of the quickest in UFC history, coming straight from the lightweight legend Jens Pulver. Like the previous Brad Kohler KO, absolutely no follow-up shots were needed. Pulver swung his left, Lewis hit the canvas, and that was all she wrote. A remarkably fast 11-second KO for Jens Pulver, and a victory that set him up for a shot at the inaugural lightweight belt, an opportunity he took to become the first ever 155-pound champion. 2001, Matt Hughes versus Carlos Newton. Maybe the most unique knockout on this list comes in next. Matt Hughes had a pretty big reputation as a fighter who was more than willing to throw in a few slams here and there whenever he got a chance. And when he got Carlos Newton in that horrible position up against the cage, there was a look on his opponent's face that you don't often see inside the cage. Basically, Newton knew that he was about to go out. What he didn't know, however, was that Matt Hughes was about to also knock himself out, or at least come close to it, as he slammed him down to the canvas. Not quite a double KO, but not too far off either. 2002, Robbie Lawler versus Tiki Gosen. The fact that Robbie Lawler is still in the fight game and still putting on UFC Fight of the Night winning bouts 2 decades after this entry. Yeah, the dude is an animal. And Tiki Gosen had the misfortune to experience this firsthand when Robbie unleashed his inner fury after getting tagged during an exchange. And it was really the follow-up shot on the mat that did it for me. Just the intensity of it all. And though it would be over a decade before he captured UFC gold, young Robbie Lawler was no joke. 2003, Vitor Belfort versus Marvin Eastman. Speaking of guys who really managed to extend their careers far beyond what we believed to be possible, this vintage Vitor Belfort KO tells you all you need to know about this Brazilian legend. He caught Marvin Eastman with a pair of very solid knees, and in true Vitor fashion, once he smelt the possibility of a finish, he unloaded a huge barrage of follow-up shots to seal the deal. Just pure violence. Need I say any more? 2004, Yves Edwards versus Josh Thompson. One of the most unique knockouts you were ever likely to see. Also came in a bout of major consequence for the early lightweight division, as two greats of the era, Yves Edwards and Josh Thompson, threw down in 2004. And I love this KO. The intent behind the setup, how he held onto his back, created momentum, pushed him away to make some space, and then landed the seminal head kick right to the dome. Edwards remains a true fighter's fighter, and this knockout is among his finest moments for sure. 2005, Rich Franklin versus Nate Quarry. Speaking of fighters and forgotten greats, the former middleweight champion Rich Franklin pretty much wrote the book on stiffening up your opponent like a board when he decimated Nate Quarry in 05. I'm going to be using the word nasty a lot during this video, and the way that Quarry went down, the way his arm extended, yeah, it was just plain nasty. Franklin remains one of the most underrated fighters of his era, and though he has many highlights, this one for me is probably the best of the lot. 2006, Scott Smith versus Pete Sell. Fight-ending sequences rarely come along that can rival the insanity of Scott Smith versus Pete Sell. These guys are a pair of hammers and they really let it show during this fight. But in one major moment, Pete Sell managed to land a huge body shot on Scott Smith, causing him to keel over. And if you know what it's like to absorb a perfectly placed shot to the midsection, you'll no doubt be cringing at the thought of his pain. In that moment, Sell knew that his opportunity had come, and probably against his better judgment, moved in for the kill. The problem? Well, Smith had one big punch left in the tank, and seeing his opportunity, he immediately snapped into action, flooring the incoming Pete Sell with a massive right hand. And he wasn't faking either. As soon as the fight was called, Scott Smith slumped to the ground. 2007, Gabriel Gonzaga versus Mirko Cro Cop. In 2007, Mirko Cro Cop had finally landed in the UFC, scoring a win in his promotional debut to bring his ongoing streak of victories to 5, with all coming by way of finish. A title eliminator against Gabriel Gonzaga was set up, and the stage seemed ready for the UFC octagon to finally play host to one of Cro Cop's trademark head kick finishes. So when Gonzaga managed to nail the Croatian legend with his own technique, there was a real silence in the arena. Did our eyes just play a trick on us, or did Gonzaga just Cro Cop Mirko Cro Cop? Yeah, this was one of the greatest knockouts of all time. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this content and would like to see more in a similar style, be sure to let us know in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the like button if the mood strikes. Anyway, back to the video. 2008, Rashad Evans versus Chuck Liddell. Getting backed up to the cage by Chuck Liddell is not an ideal position to be in, but for the legendary Rashad Evans, he somehow managed to really make it work in his favor, timing the Iceman for a right overhand that crushed the former champion. No follow-up needed. He had already made a name for himself after winning the second season of The Ultimate Fighter, but this KO put Rashad Evans on the map, earning him a title shot against Forrest Griffin, an opportunity he took with open arms, earning the gold strap from his fellow tough veteran and overall tournament winner. 2009, Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping. Speaking of overhands, one-punch knockouts just don't come much cleaner than this one. In fact, Dan Henderson's sweet revenge over Michael Bisping, after an entire season of The Ultimate Fighter spent listening to his trash talk, was in fact so sweet that he wasn't content to leave his one-shot KO at one single shot. The H-bomb landed by Hendo was just about as clean a connection as you'll ever see, but according to the man himself, that WWE-esque flying punch that followed it up was the former Pride champion's own special way of flipping the bird to Bisping, and boy was it one hell of a knockout. 2010, Carlos Condit versus Dan Hardy. Okay, this one for me is a personal favorite. I just love this knockout on so many levels. The shots exchanged, the follow-up that put Dan Hardy out. Carlos Condit is an undeniable legend of the UFC welterweight division, and when he was in his prime, his creativity on the feet was pretty much unrivaled. But in comparison to some of his crazier moments, reasons. This knockout was actually relatively straightforward. Condit and Hardy landed blows at pretty much the exact same time, but Carlos really hit his mark, following up with a concussive blow that put an end to Hardy's night. A wonderful finish from the natural-born killer. 2011, Lyoto Machida versus Randy Couture. Okay, I know there's going to be some controversy on this next one. I realize that Anderson Silva's front kick KO of Vitor Belfort also happened this year, and trust me, on a different day, it might get the nod, but I just had to give Lyoto Machida's Karate Kid moment the very narrow victory here. Indeed, it is personal preference, but for me, a crane kick of such perfect execution was such a strange sight to see inside the cage, and it wasn't fired off the back of forward movement. Both Lyoto and Randy had their feet planted. Machida feinted a few times and sprung from a pretty still position to nail Couture right on the chin. A beautiful knockout and easily a top 10 all-time finish in my book. 2012, Edson Barbosa versus Terry Edom. What can I really say about Edson Barbosa's spinning wheel kick knockout of Terry Edom that hasn't already been said about 100 times? This, for me, might be the most picture-perfect knockout in UFC history. The setup, the execution, the extremely clean connection. Barbosa already has a reputation as one of the greatest knockout artists in the sport, but my god, he could fight for another decade and never come close to equaling this total masterpiece. 2013, Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva. Is it controversial to call this knockout the best of 2013? Well, in my book, out of all of the singular blows that landed over the course of that year, absolutely none had the effect. None managed to stick in the memory, quite like Chris Weidman's stunning upset victory over Anderson Silva. To bring a legendary title reign like Silva's to an end under any circumstances is pretty damn impressive, but there was a certain sense of poetry to how Weidman caught Anderson as he opted to fly too close to the sun, playing games in his usual way against a guy in Weidman who would not be intimidated. And when that blow actually landed, it was really felt by the MMA world, making this iconic KO an image that has lived long in the memory. 2014, Dong Young Kim versus John Hathaway. Another personal favorite comes in next in the form of the insane spinning elbow knockout scored by Dong Young Kim over John Hathaway in 2014. There's just something special about a clean connection with an elbow, something that always leaves them right near the top of my end of year KO awards. And Stun Gun Kim's perfect land on Hathaway is just about as good a spinning elbow or spinning strike in general as you're ever likely to see. 2015, Holly Holm versus Ronda Rousey. 2015's top pick is another major knockout in MMA history that does earn its spot on this list thanks to the context behind it. Holly Holm, in hindsight, had the perfect style to foil the great Ronda Rousey, being a masterful striker with a control of distance that the bantamweight queen had never encountered before. And the fight itself was a total clinic, but boy did Holly cap it off in the most stunning fashion possible. A trademark head kick to the clearly rattled Rousey followed, ending one of the most dominant runs in MMA history with a bang worthy of any major occasion. 2016, Donald Cerrone versus Rick Story. Combinations don't come much cleaner than this 4-shot effort from Donald Cowboy Cerrone. It's the type of finish that really needs to be seen in slow motion to be fully appreciated. This victory came during Cerrone's 170-pound resurgence, where a lot of us began to think that he was finding a new home in the division among the elite of the elite. And this combo, the way he mixed up punches to the head and the body before finishing with a kick, yeah, this was a prime version of Cowboy, and his finish of Rick Story is one of my own all-time favorite finishing sequences. 2017, Francis Ngannou versus Alistair Overeem. No single punch on this list carried with it the same level of force that Francis Ngannou was able to generate when he fought Alistair Overeem in 2017. It was the punch that, in many ways, put Ngannou's name on the map. The punch that earned him his first title shot, and as far as nearly taking your opponent's head off, nearly taking them off their feet, I don't think I've seen a demonstration of power quite like this ever before, at least in mixed martial arts. The Reem was unconscious for quite some time afterwards, leaving Ngannou's reputation as the sport's biggest power puncher set in stone. This was truly the type of knockout that you'd only ever see from the heavyweights. 2018, Yair Rodriguez versus Chan Sung Jung. This knockout could have taken place in the first round, the second second round anytime, and it would have been a KO of the year contender. But factor in the reality of Yair Rodriguez's situation as he fired off this Hail Mary effort in the final second of a 5-round fight that he was losing. Yeah, this is an all-timer. The reverse upward elbow from a ducking position, whatever you want to call it, it was the last thing any of us were expecting. This knockout is just about as rare a moment as you were ever likely to experience in a cage fight. And for those of us who watched it live, it really did take a couple of replays for the sheer ridiculousness of this KO to actually sink in. 2019, Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren. 2019 was a pretty easy pick. The whole Ben Askren UFC thing wasn't the full story of the dude's career, but even the biggest Ben defenders were forced to tip their cap to Jorge Masvidal after he shut the incredibly outspoken wrestler up with a flying knee just a couple of seconds into their grudge match. In reality, this knockout, the fastest in UFC history, was a lot quicker than 5 seconds, but with the super necessary follow-up shots included, yeah, this was just brutal on so many levels. 2020, Joaquin Buckley versus Impa Kasanganay. 2020 was also a pretty easy pick. Hell, I would actually go as far as to say that Joaquin Buckley's back kick knockout of the formidable Impa Kasanganay is just about as high on ridiculousness as we've ever seen inside the octagon. New levels on the ridiculousometer were achieved by this middleweight prospect on that night, and it was just perfect. Everything about it, and the man deserves his place in highlight reels for years to come on the back of this uniquely violent piece of athleticism. 2021, Ignacio Bahamondes versus Roosevelt Roberts. There's just something about a late KO that really does it for me. And again, like Yair before him, if this stunning spinning kick from Ignacio Bahamondes had have landed in the opening round, it'd still get my top spot for 2021. This kid was just 24 years old when he pulled off this knockout of the year contender, a masterful one-shot KO that just looks better and better the more you watch it. I expect big things from this prospect. You just don't see knockouts this clean every day, that is for sure. And finally we come to the 2022 entry, one that, I'll be honest, I had already decided that Chandler Ferguson would win, and yet here we are. Not only did Leon Edwards manage to pull off a victory against the pound-for-pound #1, not only did he do so with one of the most picture-perfect head-kick knockouts we've ever played witness to, but he also managed to overturn a losing effort in the final minute of a title fight, the biggest fight of his life. This knockout just had everything. And while there certainly have been flashier KOs on this list, Rocky's masterpiece in the final round just really had something special. And that just about brings us up to the present day. So what did you make of our picks? And what's your own personal top 5 UFC KOs of all time? Do let us know in the comments section below. And if you want to like the video and subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. As always, thank you for watching.